I once thought that luxury could soothe loneliness. But I was wrong. The grand crystal chandeliers, the intricately gilded walls, none of it brought comfort. Instead, they only amplified the terrifying emptiness of this mansion. I was nothing more than a ghost, wandering through the endless hallways, my footsteps swallowed by the silence. But the most frightening thing wasn't the solitude. It was the feeling of being trapped, a kind of invisible imprisonment, more suffocating than any set of iron bars. 4 days ago, my husband David and my mother-in-law Margaret left for a 2-week vacation in Rome, leaving me alone with my father-in-law Henry, the man they claimed needed someone to care for him. "Someone has to stay and look after father," David had said that morning, shoving a designer coat into his suitcase. "Rome will still be there, love. We can go together next time." He smiled, but I knew there was no sincerity behind it. Margaret stood beside him, her pale grey eyes filled with a quiet arrogance. "Charlotte, you truly are a wonderful daughter-in-law," she said, her voice syrupy sweet. "As if I had a choice. We wouldn't be able to enjoy our vacation without knowing you were here." I didn't respond. I had grown used to such hollow words. In their eyes I had never truly been part of the family. I was merely useful, someone to be present when needed. A prisoner in this marriage, nothing more. When the door shut behind David and Marguerite, I returned to the vast but empty living room. My father-in-law Henry still sat in his usual red velvet armchair, gazing out at the distant garden. His face was aged, but I saw no signs of the severe illness they had spoken of. Everything about him seemed normal. But I didn't dwell on it. I simply assumed these 2 weeks would pass as they always had, drowned in boredom and isolation. I had no idea that these days would change my life forever. That evening, as I stepped into the kitchen to prepare dinner, Margaret called from Rome. Her laughter rang through the phone as if we were one big happy family. "I hope everything is going well, Charlotte." "Yes, Mother, everything is fine," I replied stiffly. "I knew you'd do a wonderful job. You're always so dedicated and we're lucky to have you in this family," she said, in a tone I could never bring myself to believe. After a few more empty pleasantries, I hung up and returned to the soup I was making. I thought I was used to isolation, but tonight the mansion felt quieter than usual. As I carried the dinner tray to Henry's room, I noticed something different. He was not sitting in silent contemplation as he usually did. His eyes held a new glimmer, one of awareness, as if he was assessing me. "How long have you been here, Charlotte?" he asked, his voice hoarse but steady. 3 years, I answered, surprised that he was initiating a conversation. Henry nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. "I see," he murmured, before turning back to the window. I didn't think much of it at the time, but a strange feeling crept into my chest, as if I had just missed something important. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind howled against the windows, tree shadows danced eerily on the walls. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, an unshakable sense of unease settling over me. I didn't know that in just a few days everything I thought I knew about this house, my husband and his family, would shatter completely. The next morning, I woke up with a heavy feeling in my chest. The mansion was cloaked in an unsettling silence. I wasn't afraid of quiet, but there was something different about today's stillness. Something I couldn't quite name. After preparing breakfast, I pushed open Henry's door, and found him already sitting in his usual chair, staring out at the garden. But this time, when I entered, he turned to look at me immediately. Gone was the sluggish demeanor, the vacant stare of an aging man. No. His eyes were sharp, watchful, as if he was studying me. I hesitated but kept my tone neutral. "Here's your breakfast, it's a beautiful day outside. Would you like to go for a walk?" Henry observed me for a few seconds before giving a slow, almost knowing smile. "Charlotte, have you ever wondered why I am here, trapped in my own home?" I frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he let out a sigh and turned back to the window, though his gaze no longer seemed distant. He was calculating. "Nothing. Just the wandering thoughts of an old man." I didn't know how to respond, but as I left the room, I could still feel his eyes following me. That day, I tried to focus on my usual household tasks, but I couldn't shake Henry's words from my mind. I had grown used to his silence, his indifference, but now, It felt like he was testing me. In the afternoon, while tidying up David's study, I accidentally found a large envelope on his desk. It bore the seal of a law firm. Beside it lay a small note, written in the elegant script I immediately recognized as Margaret's. "Look through it before Charlotte sees." I froze. My mind instantly swirled with questions. What were they hiding? Why was it so important that I not find out? I knew I shouldn't open it, but my instinct screamed that something was very, very wrong. My hands trembled slightly as I slid a letter opener under the flap and carefully prized it open. Inside was a thick stack of documents, filled with financial jargon I didn't fully understand, but there was one word that kept appearing. Will. I read slowly, carefully. Henry's assets, his companies, real estate, investments, would all be transferred entirely to David and Margaret in the event of his passing. My heart pounded. I flipped through more pages until I found a detail that made my blood run cold. My name was nowhere to be found. Not a single mention of me. Not a single clause ensuring that I would be taken care of after Henry's death. In their eyes, I was nothing. I quickly placed everything back as it was, forcing myself to act as though I had seen nothing. But I knew I had seen too much. That night, as I brought Henry his tea, I noticed that his usual faraway expression was gone. "You seem troubled tonight," he said, his tone calm yet sharp. I flinched, trying to mask my emotions. "I'm just a little tired, that's all." Henry studied me for a long moment, before speaking again. "Don't pretend with me, Charlotte. I see more than you think." A chill ran down my spine. He placed his teacup down gently, his gaze unwavering. "You found something, didn't you?" I didn't answer, but Henry smirked slightly. "It's all right. The truth, it has a way of revealing itself." I left the room, my heart pounding. Henry knew. He had known all along. The only question was, why had he chosen to let me find out? And more importantly, what was I going to do with the truth? The next morning, something about the atmosphere in the mansion felt different. Not because anything significant had happened, but because I was beginning to see everything through different eyes. Henry was not just an abandoned old man, he was watching, waiting. I had been naive to think that I was the only one being used in this house. Now, I realized that Henry was also a pawn in a far more complex game. Except, he refused to be moved at someone else's will. As I carried breakfast into the sitting room, Henry was already there, staring out at the garden as usual. But this time, the moment I set the tray down on the table, he turned to look at me immediately. "Charlotte," he spoke slowly, "what have you seen?" I froze. I couldn't admit that I had opened David's envelope, but I also couldn't lie. Henry would see right through it. So I chose silence. He let out a faint chuckle, as if my reaction didn't surprise him. "So you have seen it," he continued calmly. "That's fine. I expected this." I frowned, confused. "You expected it?" Henry slowly leaned back in his chair. "David and Margaret think they're clever. They think I know nothing. But I've seen through them for a long time." A cold tension gripped my body. He knew, not just suspected, he was certain. "You know they're trying to take your assets?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Of course," Henry replied, a bitter smile crossing his face. "I've known for years. But I've been waiting." Waiting? Waiting for what? Before I could ask, Henry leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper, as if he were about to reveal a secret. "Do you know why they haven't done anything yet, Charlotte?" I swallowed hard. It sounded like a simple question, but I knew there was something far more sinister behind it. I shook my head. Henry gave a small, knowing smile. "Because I haven't signed those documents." My eyes widened. "David can prepare all the paperwork he wants. Margaret can scheme as much as she pleases, but without my signature, everything they do is worthless." Henry's smile was sharp. "I've stalled this for years, letting them believe they had control over me, but I never intended to give them what they wanted." For the first time, I no longer saw Henry as a helpless old man, but as someone who had spent a lifetime watching and waiting. "So what do you plan to do?" I asked, my voice laced with unease. Henry looked at me, his sharp eyes unwavering. "Do you want to know the truth, Charlotte? I don't intend to leave them anything. My heart pounded in my chest. But you haven't told them. Henry shook his head. I need proof. I need them to expose themselves. A shiver ran down my spine. I had thought I was the only one trapped in this house, but now I realized that Henry was playing a dangerous game of his own, and somehow, I had been pulled into it. Before I could say anything, Henry's voice dropped, more serious than ever. Charlotte, do you want to help me? I held my breath. The weight of that question pressed down on the room like a heavy fog. I knew that once I said yes, there would be no turning back. But I also knew that if I did nothing, my fate had already been sealed by David and Margaret long ago. I met Henry's gaze, those once weary, lifeless eyes now filled with clarity and resolve. I took a deep breath. What do you need me to do? Henry smiled, and in that moment, I knew. Nothing would ever be the same again. After my conversation with Henry, I no longer saw things the same way. I had believed I was the only one being manipulated, the only one trapped in this mansion like a caged bird. But now, I understood. Henry was just as trapped as I was. The only difference was, he had been waiting for the right moment to strike back. I didn't know why he had decided to trust me. Maybe he saw that I wasn't the obedient puppet David and Margaret assumed I was. Or maybe, he simply had no other choice. I had agreed to help him, not out of some unwavering loyalty to Henry, but because I knew that if I did nothing, I would be swallowed whole by the fate David and Margaret had so carefully crafted for me. And I could not let that happen. The next morning I stepped into Henry's study with a cup of coffee, but instead of being absorbed in his newspaper as usual, he was already sitting there, eyes fixed on me as if he had been waiting. We have a lot of work to do, Charlotte, he said, his voice slow but firm. I nodded. What's the next step? Henry crossed his arms. I need to be certain about what David and Margaret are planning. I know they want my fortune, but I need something concrete, evidence. I tightened my grip around the coffee cup. You want me to spy on them? Henry smirked. No need. They'll expose themselves. You just need to pay attention to what they do and, more importantly, to what they don't want you to see. His words echoed in my mind the rest of the day. That afternoon I entered David's study under the simple pretense of cleaning. He had never paid much attention to me, so he wouldn't care if I was there. Everything in the room was neatly arranged, but I knew that secrets were never left out in the open. My eyes skimmed over the desk, the bookshelves before stopping at a locked drawer. What was in there? I tested the handle, but it didn't budge. I bit my lip, trying not to let curiosity override caution. I couldn't be reckless. If David realized someone had been snooping through his things, it would be far more dangerous. I quickly stepped back, but just as I was putting a few books back on the desk, I heard David's phone start ringing. I froze. Then I heard Margaret's voice, fast and urgent, a clear sign that this was no ordinary conversation. I know, but we can't delay any longer. Henry has lived longer than we expected. If he still hasn't signed those documents, we need to find another way. I held my breath. Documents? What were they talking about? I pressed myself against the wall, straining to hear more. David's voice was low, laced with irritation. I know, but if we push him too soon, things won't go smoothly. We have to wait for the right moment. My heart pounded in my chest. They didn't just want Henry's fortune. They were willing to take it by any means necessary. I quickly slipped out of the room before they could notice me. When I returned to Henry's room, I found him waiting, as if he had already predicted that I would have something to tell him. What did you hear? He asked, his sharp eyes fixed on me. I took a deep breath. They're getting anxious, they said. You've lived longer than they expected. Henry raised an eyebrow, but there was no surprise on his face. So, they're losing patience. I sat down, trying to steady my thoughts. Do you think they would do something? Henry didn't answer right away. He was deep in thought, as if weighing something very important. Then, with chilling certainty, he spoke. They won't wait much longer. A shiver ran down my spine. I had thought I had time to figure out their plan, but now I realized time was running out. And if I didn't act soon, I might not have another chance. That morning the mansion was as quiet as ever, but inside me, a storm was brewing. After what I had overheard between David and Margaret, I knew I couldn't afford to delay any longer. They weren't just waiting for Henry to die naturally, they were planning to speed up the process. I glanced at Henry, who sat by the window, his gaze distant but not empty. He knew what was coming. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice tight with worry. Henry turned to me, a faint smile appearing on his lined face. "Charlotte, I've lived long enough to know when someone wants me gone." His words sent a chill through me. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to remain steady. "Then what do we do?" Henry leaned back in his chair, his sharp gaze unwavering. "I need one final move, a strike they can't recover from." I nodded. "Then we need to prepare now." That afternoon, as I was organizing Henry's paperwork in his study, I heard a noise at the front gate. The familiar sound of a black Mercedes engine rumbled, and minutes later, David and Margaret stepped into the house. Their smiles were polished, but I could see the barely concealed eagerness in their eyes. "Charlotte," Margaret spoke first, setting her designer handbag on the table, her gaze sweeping quickly across the room. "Is everything all right? Is Father well?" She was checking. I forced a neutral smile. "Yes, everything is the same as always." David shrugged off his coat, barely glancing at me before turning to Henry. "Father, I hope you've had time to consider the documents I left last week." My stomach tightened. He wanted Henry to sign over his estate. Henry looked up, his eyes scanning David and Margaret before letting out a quiet chuckle. "I've given it a great deal of thought." David held his breath, waiting. "And I've decided that I won't be signing anything." Silence crashed over the room. David's smile vanished, and Margaret stiffened like a statue. "What did you just say, Father?" Henry raised an eyebrow, taking a slow sip of his tea before speaking again, his tone as cold as ice. "I have no intention of leaving anything to either of you." Margaret immediately interjected, her voice dripping with forced sweetness. "Father, don't say such things. This is the family's estate." "No," Henry cut her off sharply. "It's my estate, and I alone decide who it belongs to." David's hands clenched into fists. I could see the rage building behind his eyes, but he struggled to maintain his composure. "So, what do you plan to do with it?" David asked, his voice lower now, stripped of any pretense of civility. Henry met his gaze without flinching. Then, he slowly placed a stack of documents on the table. "I've transferred everything into a charitable trust. As of today, neither of you have any claim to a single cent of it." Margaret gasped, her face draining of color. "No, that's impossible." David snatched the documents, flipping through them frantically, his eyes scanning every word. As he reached the final page, I saw his hands tremble with barely restrained fury. He looked up at Henry, his expression filled with pure hatred. "You can't do this to me." Henry smirked. "I just did." The silence that followed was thick with barely contained rage. David slammed the papers onto the table, his furious gaze shifting to me. "You," he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "It was you, wasn't it? You put this idea in his head." I met his eyes, keeping my expression calm despite the hammering of my heart. "I didn't do anything, David. Didn't your father just say he made this decision long ago?" David's face burned red with anger. He turned back to Henry, as if searching for some way to change his mind. "Father, think this through. You can't just abandon me and Mother like this. We're your family." Henry stared at him, his gaze unwavering. "Family doesn't betray each other, David." Margaret suddenly burst into tears, but this time, no one in the room believed them anymore. Henry sighed, then stood up, pressing both hands against the table. "You have 1 week to move out of this house." David looked stunned, his eyes widening. "What?" "I will give you enough money to live a normal life," Henry continued, "but you will never get what you truly wanted." I saw David's hands clench into tight fists. He was trying to contain his rage, but one thing was clear. He wasn't willing to lose. And that worried me more than anything. David stormed out of the room, but I knew he wasn't accepting defeat. A man like him wouldn't back down so easily. Margaret, on the other hand, remained frozen in her chair, her face filled with shock. "No, Henry, you can't do this to us. We've been by your side for so many years." Henry remained calm. "By my side, or waiting for me to die so you could take everything?" Margaret stiffened. The truth had been laid bare. There was no room for pretense anymore. She stood up, adjusting her dress with a prideful air. "You will regret this, Henry." "No," he replied instantly. "The ones who will regret it aren't me." Margaret turned on her heels and walked toward the door, but before she left, she cast me a glance. And in her eyes, I saw something far more dangerous than anger, a warning. I clenched my hands into fists, but said nothing. Only when the door finally closed, did Henry let out a deep sigh, leaning back into his chair. "They won't stop now," he said, his voice dropping into something darker. I swallowed hard. I knew that. And I also knew that I couldn't afford to show any fear. That night, as I was preparing to go to bed, I received a text from an unknown number. "Do you think you've won? Don't be so confident." A chill ran down my spine. I didn't need to ask who had sent it. I sat on the edge of my bed, forcing myself to stay calm. I had known this wouldn't end easily, but what I hadn't expected was how far David was willing to go. I had to warn Henry. The next morning, I stepped into Henry's study and immediately noticed that he looked more exhausted than usual. The lines on his forehead were deeper and his eyes were heavy with concern. "Are you all right?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Henry nodded, but I didn't believe him. "David sent me a threat last night," I said bluntly, cutting straight to the point. Henry was silent for a moment, then he gave a small nod. "I expected that." I frowned. "Aren't you worried?" Henry took a slow sip of his tea before replying. "I've dealt with men like David my entire life, Charlotte, but he isn't the one who concerns me the most. Margaret is." A shiver ran through me. I had always known Margaret was manipulative, but dangerous. "Where do you think that?" I asked. Henry set his cup down on the table. "Because David is greedy, but he's impulsive. Margaret is the real threat." I swallowed. "What do you mean?" Henry exhaled deeply. "Because she doesn't act on emotion, she calculates. If David threatens you outright, Margaret will take a different route, quieter but far more effective." A growing sense of unease settled in my stomach. That night, as I went downstairs to get a glass of water, I heard a faint noise near the back door. I froze, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Someone was outside. Slowly I stepped toward the window, carefully pulling back the curtain. But there was nothing, just darkness. Still, I could feel it. Someone was watching me. I backed away, swallowing hard. Was I imagining things? Or was something really happening? I returned to my bedroom. But this time I locked the door. I couldn't let anything unexpected happen, not when I knew that David and Margaret were getting desperate. The next morning, when I came downstairs, Henry was sitting in his armchair, staring out the window as usual. But this time, when he turned to look at me, his eyes were filled with caution. "Is something wrong?" I asked. Henry tilted his head slightly. "Do you feel like you're being watched?" I froze. "Yes," I said quietly. Henry nodded slowly. "Good, because so do I." A chill ran down my spine. Something was wrong. David and Margaret weren't accepting defeat. And now they were planning their final move. That morning, the air in the mansion felt heavier than ever. It wasn't the grey weather outside or the cold, towering walls. It was the undeniable knowledge that I was being watched. After my conversation with Henry last night, I no longer had any doubts. David and Margaret weren't giving up, and I knew they had already begun to act. As I walked down the staircase, I could feel it. The weight of unseen eyes following my every step. I tried to stay calm, but the unease clung to me, refusing to let go. Henry sat in the living room as usual, but when I placed his coffee on the table, he didn't look at me right away. Instead, he was deep in thought, his expression unreadable. "Did you sleep at all?" I asked. Henry shook his head. "Charlotte, have you noticed that something has changed in this house?" I frowned. "What do you mean?" Henry exhaled slowly, his gaze sweeping across the walls, the corners of the room, places I had never paid much attention to before. "Someone has been in here." His words sent a shiver through me. Someone had been inside. When? And how did he know? I glanced around the living room. Everything looked the same. The armchair in its usual spot, the rug neatly laid out, no signs of disturbance. "Are you sure?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Henry nodded firmly. "I'm certain. They didn't take anything, but they were looking for something. A wave of fear rose inside me. Maybe I had been right when I heard that noise near the back door last night. But I hadn't checked properly. I had convinced myself it was just my imagination. David and Margaret had started moving, and now I had no idea how far they were willing to go. That afternoon I decided to check everything in Henry's study. If someone had been here, there had to be a trace of it somewhere. I ran my fingers along the drawers, my eyes searching for anything out of place. When I opened the bottom drawer, I noticed an envelope had been shifted. My heart pounded. This was where Henry kept important documents. I quickly opened the envelope and saw that some of the papers had been moved, but nothing was missing. What had they been looking for? I carefully put everything back in place. If David and Margaret were watching us, I couldn't let them know that I was onto them. When I returned to the living room, Henry was already looking at me, as if he knew exactly what I had just found. "They searched your documents," I said, my voice steady. Henry nodded slightly. "I know." I frowned. "You were prepared for this, weren't you?" Henry took a sip of his tea before replying. "Charlotte, I've been waiting for this move for a long time." For the first time since I stepped into this mansion, I realized that Henry was not the weak, helpless old man I had once thought he was. He had known everything. He had seen it all coming. And he was playing a far longer game than anyone else in this house. That night, I walked through the long hallway toward my bedroom. As I passed David's study, I heard a low voice. I froze. David was on the phone. Pressing myself against the wall, I strained to listen. "We can't wait any longer," David said, frustration thick in his voice. "If the old man won't sign, we'll have to find another way." I held my breath. There was a long pause before David spoke again, his voice quieter, more dangerous. "I don't care how you do it. I just need him to not be a problem anymore." My heart stopped. David was planning to get rid of Henry. I quickly retreated to my room, locking the door behind me. My entire body was trembling, but I didn't have time for fear. I had to warn Henry. Tomorrow morning, we had to act, before it was too late. Well, I didn't sleep that night. David's words echoed in my mind like a death sentence. "I don't care how you do it, I just need him to not be a problem anymore." He had gone too far. I knew he was greedy, but I never thought he would be willing to kill his own father just to get his hands on the fortune. I had to act before it was too late. The next morning when I stepped into the living room, Henry was already waiting. "You heard something last night, didn't you?" he asked, his voice calm but his eyes deep in thought. I nodded, my chest tightening. "David is planning to kill you." Henry sighed, unsurprised. "I expected this." I bit my lip, my heart racing. "We have to do something now. If we don't—" "I already have a plan," Henry interrupted. I looked at him, confused. "What plan?" Henry didn't answer immediately. He stood up, walked over to his desk and opened a drawer. When he turned back, a small USB drive was in his hand. "I've gathered evidence of everything they've done over the years," Henry said, placing the USB in my hand. "Forged financial documents, email exchanges about coercing me into signing papers, even recordings of their conversations." My eyes widened. "You were prepared for this?" Henry gave a faint smile, but there was no joy in his eyes. "Charlotte, I am not a naive man. I've let them play their game for years and now, I'm simply striking back." I tightened my grip around the USB. "How are we going to use this?" Henry looked at me, his gaze filled with determination. "Send it to the police." That afternoon I drove to meet Nathan, Henry's trusted lawyer. I handed him the USB, along with a copy of the key documents Henry had prepared. Nathan examined everything carefully before looking up at me. "This is undeniable evidence. If we send this to the police and the media, David and Margaret won't have a way out." I took a deep breath. "Then, let's do it." Nathan nodded. "I'll take care of it." That night, the mansion was eerily silent. I sat beside Henry, both of us knowing that this was the last night before everything changed. By tomorrow morning, the authorities would step in. David and Margaret would no longer be able to harm anyone. "Are you afraid?" Henry asked, his voice warm and steady. I turned to him. "Yes, but I also know this is the only way." Henry nodded. You're stronger than you think, Charlotte. I clenched my hands. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. I was no longer the weak woman I had been 3 years ago. 4 days later. The news about the investigation into David and Margaret flooded every media outlet. The evidence from Henry's USB had forced the police to act immediately. David was arrested at his office with no chance to escape. Margaret tried to deny the accusations, but the recordings spoke for themselves. Both of them faced severe charges, with no way to evade the consequences of their actions. I stood in front of the mansion, watching as the police escorted David away. When he looked at me, his eyes burned with hatred. "You ruined my life," he hissed. I didn't flinch. I met his gaze, calm and unwavering. "No, David, you ruined your own life." The officers shoved him into the police car, the door slammed shut. And just like that, it was over. 1 month later. The mansion was no longer a place suffocated by greed and betrayal. It was no longer a symbol of manipulation. It had become a place of transformation. Henry followed through on his decision to transfer all his wealth into a charitable foundation, just as he had planned from the beginning. The mansion was turned into a center to help those in need, a place of hope rather than a legacy of deceit. And me? I left. Not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to build a life of my own, on my own terms. Before I left, Henry embraced me. "Charlotte, you'll always have a home here." I smiled softly, looking at him one last time. "Thank you for everything." Then I walked away. I had once thought I was a prisoner, a pawn in a game I had no control over. But I was wrong. I wasn't a pawn. I was the player. And this time, I won. From this story we learn an important lesson. Stay vigilant, don't allow yourself to become a victim of manipulation, and take control of your own destiny. When faced with betrayal, greed and deceit, don't surrender, observe, gather evidence, and act wisely. Strength and courage can turn the tide, protecting what's rightfully yours. Most importantly, justice always prevails, but only if we dare to fight for it. No one controls our fate. Except us. What do you think of this story? Have you ever encountered a similar situation in your life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to follow the channel so you won't miss more compelling stories about life, family, and the lessons worth remembering.